Have you ever felt like the world made a mistake with you? Like someone looked at your life and decided you didn't deserve the best of what your family had to offer? My name is Evelyn Morgan, and the day my grandmother's will was read, I felt like a character written out of my own story. While my brother Nathan was handed the keys to a luxury apartment in downtown Seattle, I was left with a house. Not just any house, a crumbling wooden structure in a forgotten Wyoming town I hadn't seen since I was 5. I didn't even remember what it looked like. I just remembered the cold. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever received something that seemed like an insult, but turned out to be a blessing? If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly discarded, this story might speak to a part of your soul you haven't visited in a while. Because what I discovered in that falling apart house changed the way I saw my family, myself, and everything I thought I had lost. So take a breath, lean in close, and let me take you back to the moment everything fell apart, so I could begin again. When I stepped out of the notary's office, the crisp Seattle wind hit harder than usual. I walked toward our old gray sedan, where Derek, my husband of 6 years, was waiting with crossed arms and a furrowed brow. I opened the door, slowly slid in, and told him what happened. He didn't ask. He just stared ahead, then scoffed. "You're telling me your brother got the apartment, and you got a shack in the middle of nowhere?" I nodded. Silence. And then, like water boiling over, he erupted words, sharp, cruel, as if he'd been waiting for this disappointment to justify everything. "You really can't do anything right, can you?" he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "I told you not to expect anything. But you had to build castles in the sky like always." I didn't know what to say. We'd had arguments before, but this felt different. Final. A house in Wyoming, he laughed bitter. "Maybe that suits you. You're stuck in the past anyway, always clinging to books and memories while the rest of us are out here trying to survive." It wasn't just about the will. It never was. I'd seen it coming piece by piece, love turning into tolerance and tolerance into blame. That evening, Derek didn't come home. When he finally walked in, he didn't take off his coat. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I'm done, Evelyn. I'm tired of dragging you along. You've never brought anything to this marriage but your sad stories and your failures." I remember standing still, holding a mug of tea that had already gone cold. I wanted to defend myself, to remind him of all the little sacrifices, the jobs I took so he could pursue his dreams, the rent I paid when he was between clients, but I didn't. Because deep down I knew, love doesn't sound like that. It doesn't keep score and tally wounds like debts to be collected. So I nodded. I packed 2 bags, some clothes, my grandmother's locket, and a journal I hadn't written in for years. I left our shared apartment and didn't look back. It's strange how the end of something painful can feel like relief, like stepping out of a room filled with smoke and realizing you'd been choking the whole time. That night, I booked a bus ticket to Stillwater, Wyoming. I didn't know what I'd find there, or if the house was even standing. I just knew I couldn't keep circling the same heartbreak over and over. Sometimes you don't need a plan, you just need movement. I told myself, go where the silence leads you. Go where you are not reminded of everything you aren't. And so, as the bus pulled away from Seattle's city lights and into the long stretch of dusk-lined highway, I rested my head against the cold glass window. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my grandmother's voice, not in words, but in warmth. Maybe she had left me more than an old house. Maybe she'd left me a chance to begin again. And that quiet hope carried me all the way to Stillwater. The bus ride felt like slipping through time. As we moved farther from the city, the buildings thinned, the roads narrowed, and the silence grew heavy. Stillwater wasn't even marked on the map in bold letters, just a faded dot at the end of a county highway. When the bus finally stopped, it was just me stepping off. No crowd, no movement. Just wind-cold air and a sky that looked too big for someone so small. I stood there with my bag in hand, staring down a dirt road lined with empty porches, peeling paint and mailboxes that hadn't seen letters in years. The house sat at the very end of the lane, slightly tilted like it had grown tired of standing straight. Weeds climbed the broken fence like vines reclaiming lost territory. The mailbox still bore the name Morgan, in worn-out paint barely legible. I hesitated at the gate, Every creak of the hinge, every crunch of gravel beneath my boots made me feel like I was waking ghosts. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the kind of reverence you feel walking into a room where something important once happened, even if you don't know what. When I pushed open the front door, I expected dust-rot decay. But instead I was greeted by stillness, warm, undisturbed, and oddly clean. The floorboards groaned, but there was no mold, no cobwebs. Furniture sat where it belonged, draped in linen as though someone had left in a hurry but intended to return. A faint scent lingered in the air, not unpleasant. It smelled of dried lavender and old books like memories sealed in wood and fabric. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt patient. I walked slowly from room to room. In the kitchen, a teapot rested on the stove, as if waiting to be used again. The wallpaper curled slightly at the edges, floral patterns faded but familiar. I touched the windowsill and saw scratches where something small a cat maybe once pawed to get out. Every detail whispered a life once lived, not forgotten. There was no television, no noise, just quiet. And in that quiet, something inside me began to settle, as if the ache of the past week had finally found a place to rest. It struck me then this house wasn't a punishment. It was a time capsule, a message in a bottle sent forward by someone who believed I'd come back eventually. Maybe the town was forgotten. Maybe the structure needed fixing. But there was something sacred here. A lesson, perhaps, about how beauty doesn't always shout it waits. It doesn't dazzle, it endures. You just have to slow down enough to notice it. I spent that first night on a creaky couch wrapped in an old quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and sunshine. I didn't cry. I didn't worry. I just listened to the wind to the house, breathing to myself. And for the first time in a long while, I felt held, not by someone, but by a space that said you are allowed to begin again here. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the window panes, casting golden squares across the floor. I rose curious to explore more, especially the far corner of the hallway, where a narrow door stood strangely flush with the wall. Something about it didn't match the rest of the house. As I stepped closer, I felt that same quiet hum in my chest, like the story was just beginning to turn its page. The narrow door in the hallway didn't have a knob, just an old iron latch, rusted and stiff. It looked like part of the wall, like it had been designed to be overlooked. I hesitated for a moment, half expecting it to be a storage closet or some forgotten pantry. But something about its presence felt intentional, like a whisper in the silence saying, "Look closer." I pressed my hand against the wood. It was cold, solid, and strangely smooth. When I finally managed to lift the latch, the hinges creaked loud enough to stir the dust around me. What I saw inside made me stop breathing. It wasn't a pantry. It wasn't a closet. It was a room hidden and windowless, lined from floor to ceiling, with wooden shelves each groaning gently under the weight of old books. Leather-bound, cloth-bound paperbacks, and hardcover spines in French, German, Latin, and English. Some glimmered with gold leaf titles. Others were hand-stitched with fragile threads. The air smelled like ink and time, like parchment and secrets. I stood at the threshold, stunned. This wasn't just a collection. It was a life's work, a shrine to learning, and somehow, impossibly, it was mine. I stepped inside, running my fingers along the bindings. My hand shook slightly as I picked up a thin volume wrapped in velvet, the title etched in faded Cyrillic script. I couldn't read it, but I felt the weight of it, literal and emotional. These weren't decorative books. They had been loved, handled, studied, passed down. A small wooden desk sat in the corner with an inkwell still stained blue, and a reading lamp covered in a floral shade. Dust floated in the air like memories suspended in sunlight. I whispered aloud, why was this hidden? Maybe because some things aren't meant to be shown until they're ready to be seen. I thought about my grandmother then, not as the fading woman I'd last seen in a hospital bed, but as someone younger, vibrant, passionate. I imagined her in this room, flipping through pages, scribbling notes, whispering names of authors to herself like spells. All those times I thought she was just baking pies and knitting scarves. Maybe she was also studying philosophy, history, poetry. Maybe she saw something in me when I was little, something that made her want to keep this place waiting just in case I ever needed it. There's a kind of love that doesn't declare itself loudly. It waits in quiet corners like this one. It says, I see you, even if the world doesn't, I do. As I sat down at the old desk, a sense of belonging settled into my bones. The kind I hadn't felt in years. I pulled open the first drawer, hoping to find a candle or a match, and instead I found something else, a small brass key wrapped in silk, and beneath it a faded envelope marked with my name in my grandmother's handwriting. It was the kind of script that made me tear up immediately, neat, thoughtful, and unmistakably hers. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The key was warm from the silk, and the envelope was thin but heavy with meaning. I knew right then that this story was just beginning. And whatever was locked away was meant only for me. I held the envelope like it might vanish if I blinked. My name, Evelyn Grace Morgan, was written in that unmistakable cursive, careful, elegant, slightly tilted to the right. My grandmother always wrote like she was composing a love letter to the world. I remember being 8 years old, sitting beside her on rainy afternoons, watching her draft recipes, journal entries, and sometimes tiny poems she never showed anyone else. She'd let me dip my pen into her ink and practice my name over and over. That was the first time I believed words could hold magic. I opened the letter slowly, careful not to tear the paper. It began simply, "My dearest Evelyn." Even just those 3 words broke something open in my chest. The tone was warm, direct, and impossibly intimate, as though she had written it knowing exactly what kind of person I'd become. She spoke of memory, of choices, of legacy, not in terms of money or land, but of values. You're probably wondering why Nathan got the apartment and you got the house, she wrote. But the truth is, I didn't leave you a house. I left you a key, a path, a purpose. She explained how over the years she'd watched me with quiet pride, the way I lingered over books. How I'd ask questions that no one else thought to ask, how I listened more than I spoke. She saw me not as the shy girl everyone overlooked, but as the heart of the family's deeper truth. Nathan needs the world to know he's important, she wrote. But you, my darling, already are. You just haven't been told enough. I read those words again and again, like they might fade if I didn't memorize them. Inside the envelope was also a folded list books, to be found a name of a man in town she once trusted, and a note about a hidden compartment in the basement safe. She gave clear instructions, but with gentle language. It wasn't just guidance, it was trust. She believed I would know what to do. And in that moment, I started to believe it too. There's a difference between being given something and being entrusted with it. That letter didn't just explain the inheritance, it explained me. As I sat there alone in the quiet glow of the secret library, I thought about the kind of love that plans ahead. That leaves behind not just money, but maps. My grandmother didn't give me wealth, she gave me wisdom. Waiting quietly for me to be ready. She gave me evidence that I was seen, valued, understood. And maybe that's what we all crave, not applause, not approval, but to know someone believed in us, even when we couldn't quite believe in ourselves. I folded the letter back carefully and held the key in my palm. It felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning. Whatever was in that basement safe, I was ready to find it. Not just for her, but for the girl I used to be, the woman I was becoming, and the legacy I was finally learning how to carry. With new resolve, I walked toward the creaky staircase and began my descent into the basement. The basement stairs creaked under my steps, but the air wasn't musty like I'd expected. It was cool, dry, and still. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a gentle amber glow. In the far corner, beneath a folded tarp, stood a large metal safe, tall, aged, with a brass dial and an aura of mystery. I knelt down, heart pounding, and inserted the key my grandmother had wrapped in silk. It didn't turn. Of course not. This wasn't just about unlocking steel, it was about understanding the woman who hid it. I sat cross-legged beside the safe, thinking hard. My birthday. Her birthday. An anniversary. Then I remembered a date she'd mentioned so often it had etched itself into my memory, the day her father gave her her first book. I turned the dial slowly, deliberately entering the numbers. 04-1852. A soft click answered. The door creaked open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash, no jewelry, just folders, letters, photographs, and what looked like very old book receipts, catalogs, and certificates. On top lay a leather-bound notebook labeled Appraisals, Private Collection. I flipped through the pages, eyes widening. My grandmother had carefully documented the estimated value, origin, and historical significance of each rare book in the hidden library. Some were valued in the tens of thousands. One entry, dated over 2 decades ago, marked a specific 16th century volume as priceless, likely one of a kind. It was overwhelming, not because of the monetary value, but because she had done this in silence, quietly, purposefully, as though she was preparing for me to discover it only when I was ready. And I was, or at least I was willing to try. I took photos of a few pages and sent them to a rare bookshop in Seattle with a short message: inherited private collection. Would love an informal evaluation. 2 days later, a man named Martin called. His voice was warm, curious. "Do you have time for a visit?" he asked. "Some of the titles you shared, I haven't seen in decades." When he arrived the following morning, he didn't come in a suit or with fanfare. Just a notepad, white gloves, and a look of quiet awe. He spent hours in the library barely speaking, just tracing spines, flipping pages, and taking notes. I watched him the way I imagined my grandmother had watched me as a child, hoping I would understand the value of what I was holding. Finally, Martin closed a book gently and looked at me. "Evelyn," he said, "this isn't just a collection. It's a cultural inheritance. Museums would line up for some of these titles. This volume alone," he said, pointing to a weathered Latin manuscript, "could sell for the price of a downtown apartment." I felt breathless, not greedy, not triumphant, but deeply seen. It wasn't about the money, it was about the meaning. There's something life-changing about realizing your worth wasn't invisible. It was just waiting in the right light. That night, I sat by the fireplace, my grandmother's letter in my lap, the quiet flicker of flames reflecting in the window. I didn't know yet whether I'd sell the books, preserve them, or share them. But I knew one thing: I finally understood the difference between being given something and being chosen to protect it. And in the morning, I would begin to rebuild. The morning after Martin's visit, I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, looking out over the overgrown garden and the house's weather-beaten exterior. The shingles curled at the edges, the porch railing leaned like it was tired, and the gutters hadn't seen a cleaning in years. And yet there was something quietly noble about it all. Like the house had held its breath through decades of silence, waiting for someone to believe it was still worth saving. I took a deep breath and made a decision: I wouldn't leave. I would restore this place, not for resale, but for rebirth. The first few days were humbling. I bought work gloves, a rake, and paintbrushes from a hardware store 20 miles away. At first, the villagers watched me with polite distance, curious but cautious. Stillwater wasn't the kind of place where outsiders came to settle, especially not alone, and with a strange story about inherited books. But small gestures go a long way in small towns. I waved to a woman hanging laundry. She nodded. The next day, she left a basket of apples on my porch. That's how it begins, with a smile, with kindness unspoken. Her name was Mabel. She had lived in Stillwater all her life and remembered my grandmother fondly. "Your gran used to read to the children at the church hall," she said, handing me a jar of peach preserves. Had a voice like warm bread. Mabel offered the number of a local handyman named Jonas, who, as she put it, had a soft spot for houses older than himself. When Jonas arrived, he didn't say much. He walked the perimeter, tapped on beams, ran his hands over the walls, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he looked at me and said, "She's not dead yet." Working alongside Jonas taught me patience. Some mornings we worked in silence, fixing loose boards, sealing windows, sanding years of neglect into smooth new starts. Other days we talked about our families, the weather, the strange comfort of routines. With every nail driven in, I felt a part of myself being rebuilt too. I had spent years apologizing for who I was, too quiet, too sensitive, too stuck in the past. But here in this broken house, I felt purposeful, whole. There's something powerful about choosing to stay when walking away would be easier. Progress was slow but visible. Paint brightened the porch. New glass sparkled in the kitchen windows. One afternoon, a few neighborhood kids wandered in, curious about the books I'd left stacked by the door. I let them pick one each. Their eyes lit up like I'd handed them treasure. That night I journaled for the first time in years. Healing doesn't always look like breakthroughs, I wrote. Sometimes it looks like steady hands, wood shavings, and warm apples from a stranger. By the end of the month, the house had changed, but so had I. The creaks in the floor felt familiar now, like an old friend sighing at the end of a long day. And just when I thought I was done discovering, I remembered something from my grandmother's list. A name, someone she trusted. A person who knew more about our family history than I ever could alone. I decided it was time to reach out. His name was Arthur Bell. My grandmother called him Artie in her letters, a nickname that made him sound like someone from another time, which, in a way, he was. I found his number scribbled in the margins of an old notebook, next to a pressed forget-me-not, and the note he remembers everything. I dialed the number, heart racing. A warm voice answered, slow and steady. "Well now," he said when I introduced myself. "You sound just like Maria." He paused, then added, "Come by, I've been waiting." Arthur lived about 30 minutes out on a quiet road that curved along the hills. His home was modest but well kept, with bird feeders hanging from every tree and wind chimes that sang in soft dissonance. He met me at the porch, cane in hand, blue eyes sharp behind thick glasses. "I figured you'd come sooner or later," he said, as if this meeting had always been part of some larger story. Inside, the house smelled of tobacco, cinnamon, and old records. The kind of smell that hugs you before a word is spoken. We sat in his sunroom, sipping tea that tasted like apples and ginger. I told him everything: the will, the house, the library, the letter. He listened without interruption, nodding slowly. When I finished, he looked out the window, lost in thought. "Your grandmother," he said finally, "was the smartest woman I ever knew. But she carried burdens you'll never read about in those letters." He pulled out an old photo album from a nearby drawer and laid it open between us. This, he pointed to a sepia-toned image of two girls in matching braids, was her sister. Died young. And that he turned the page was your great-grandfather. A quiet revolutionary. Books were his way of fighting back. The stories poured out like rain, stories of loss, of love, of resilience threaded through generations. "Evelyn the Third," he called me. "You come from women who endure even when they break. Women who didn't need to be loud to be powerful." I felt something stir inside me, a sense of belonging, not just to a house or a woman I missed, but to a legacy that ran deeper than inheritance. Arthur handed me a folded letter, yellowed with time. "She left this with me years ago. Said to give it to you when the house started breathing again." I opened it that night by the fireplace. It was shorter than the others, but just as rich. In it, my grandmother wrote about the difference between building a life and inheriting one. "You'll know you're doing it right," she wrote, "when the walls start to feel like they're listening, when even the dust seems to settle in your favor." I smiled through tears. She had always known I'd return, not just to the house, but to myself. That weekend, I began planning something bigger. The library wasn't meant to stay hidden. It had breathed long enough in silence. Now it was time to let others step inside and see what I had come to see. The call came on a gray Thursday afternoon. I recognized the number even before it lit up the screen. Nathan. I hadn't spoken to him since the day the will was read. My thumb hovered over the decline button for a second, but something told me to pick up. "Hey, Evie," he said, his voice awkwardly casual. "Got a minute?" He sounded the same, confident, slightly rushed, like he had 10 more important things to do. But under that surface, I caught a hint of hesitation. That was new. We agreed to meet in Stillwater a few days later. He showed up in a sharp gray coat and city shoes that didn't suit the gravel path. I watched him look around the house with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "I didn't think you'd stay," he said, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Thought you'd sell it and be done." I smiled politely. "I thought you'd visit sooner," I replied. We sat on the porch, an old quilt between us, the silence thick with years of unspoken things. He cleared his throat. "I guess I owe you some kind of explanation." But the apology never came. Instead, he talked about his job, the stress, the pressure to maintain appearances. "I thought the apartment would make things easier," he admitted. "And honestly, I didn't think Grandma would leave you anything worth keeping." I nodded. Neither did I, but I was wrong. I didn't say it with bitterness. I said it with peace. Because by now, I'd learned something that no inheritance could teach me. You don't need an apology to heal. You just need clarity. Nathan didn't need to be the villain. I didn't need to be the victim. We were just two people trying to navigate a legacy we never fully understood. I showed him the library, let him hold. One of the oldest books, watched his fingers brush the pages like he was touching history for the first time. He looked at me differently after that, not like the quiet sister he overlooked, but like someone holding something too delicate to measure. He didn't ask for the house. He didn't offer the apartment. We didn't exchange forgiveness wrapped in bows. But when he left, he said, "I get it now." And that was enough. There's a quiet strength in not needing closure to look someone in the eye and still choose kindness. I didn't rebuild this house to prove anything to Nathan. I did it to remember who I was before the world told me otherwise. And in doing that, I stopped needing his approval. I started needing my own. That evening, I pulled out my journal and wrote, "Sometimes the apology you crave isn't meant to come from someone else. It comes from within when you finally stop apologizing for who you are." I closed the book, lit a candle in the library, and sat by the window. Outside, the night was quiet, but full of stories, stars, and something new forming in the shadows of what I'd restored. Tomorrow, I'd open the door to others. The day I opened the doors to the library, the sky was soft with morning fog, the kind that makes everything feel gentle and full of possibility. I placed a small wooden sign outside that read "Stillwater Reading Room, free to all." It didn't need to be fancy, just honest. The first visitors were children, curious, wide-eyed fingers brushing spines like they were touching magic. Then came the teachers, the retirees, the quiet ones who had been waiting for something to return life to this little town. What I had once called a forgotten house was now a beating heart again. In those final days of winter, as the community began to gather around words and wonder, I often sat in the corner of the library wrapped in my grandmother's old quilt, just watching people find themselves in books, watching Stillwater remember its own story. And I realized this legacy wasn't something I'd inherited. It was something I'd built choice by choice. From the moment I stepped off that bus carrying more sadness than certainty, to the day I turned this house into a home for others, every step mattered. Looking back, I see how each chapter led here. The moment the will split my world in two, the sting of my husband's rejection, the quiet courage of rebuilding with my own hands, the letters from my grandmother tucked into corners like little breadcrumbs of faith, the conversations with Arthur, the hesitant visit from Nathan. Each moment layered like pages in a book, bound by one thing: the decision to stay and see what was possible. I wasn't just reclaiming a house. I was reclaiming myself. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not what's written in a will, but what's written in how we live. It's the way we show up when no one's watching. The way we carry memory forward, not to preserve the past, but to light the future. My grandmother saw something in me before I ever could. And through this journey, I've learned to see it too. Not just in me, but in everyone who steps through that door searching for something quiet, steady, and real. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or unloved, maybe this story is yours too. Maybe what you thought was a burden is actually a beginning. And maybe you're exactly where you're meant to be, standing on the edge of something meaningful, waiting to begin your own chapter. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your own turning point, your hidden inheritance, your small, brave choice that changed everything. And if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because more stories like this are coming, and I'd be honored to have you walk with me through them. Until then, remember, the legacy we carry isn't about what we're given. It's about what we choose to keep and what we choose to share.